So, as it turns out, I'm a really strong reader. I love reading, I'm a very avid reader, and I'm actually really good at it. I can summarize and identify the main idea and make inferences with pretty much any text you put in front of me, with a few exceptions. Now, my husband's an engineer, and so we have this book laying around our house. It's called Thermodynamics Weirdness. Here's the thing, I know nothing about thermodynamics. So, if I'm reading this book and you ask me to summarize it, I would struggle. Now, it's not because I don't know how to summarize, it's because I don't know anything about thermodynamics weirdness. But here's the thing. If I were a student in one of our classrooms, if I were struggling with the ability to summarize a text, what my teacher probably would do is give me more practice with summarization. They'd give me passages and questions, task cards, graphic organizers. I'd probably get pulled into a small group to work on my summarization strategies. But more summarization practice isn't going to help me summarize this text because I don't actually need help learning how to summarize. What I need is vocabulary to understand thermodynamics. I need to understand terms like entropy and the adiabatic process. I need to understand a little bit about what thermodynamics is, so I need some background knowledge. I need some understanding of how this text is organized and what type of information I can expect. And I probably need someone to walk me through it so I can discuss and share the information that I'm learning and process it with somebody. So what I want us to realize is that comprehension is not achieved through teaching individual skills like we often do in our upper elementary classrooms. So instead of teaching something like strategy of the week or teaching an individual lesson on main idea, we want to shift our approach to comprehension. And instead, we want to think about how can we create the conditions in our classroom that lead to comprehension. Now, if you're wondering what exactly that looks like, the good news is that during this video, I'm going to share with you a really simple framework that will help you create the conditions that will lead to comprehension for your students. Hey there, I'm Sarah Marie, creator of the Stellar Literacy Collective and host of the Stellar Teacher Podcast. Now in this video, we're going to talk about what reading comprehension is. And like I said, I'm going to share a framework with you that will help you achieve comprehension for your students. So let's start by talking about what comprehension is. So while it might seem logical that comprehension is a skill, it's actually the outcome. Comprehension is the result of reading. It is our end goal. It's the thing that we're trying to achieve with any reading experience. And one of the visuals that can really help us understand this idea that comprehension is the outcome is Scarborough's reading rope. How many of you have seen this image before? So I love Scarborough's reading rope because it really hits home this idea that comprehension is the end goal. In this image, we see that when we weave together language comprehension and word recognition elements, the end result is skilled reading. And skilled reading is just a really fancy word for being able to fluently read the text and extract meaning from it. So how do we get to this skilled reading? Well, we need to be intentional about incorporating the elements of language comprehension into our reading experiences. So whether we are getting ready to read a chapter book or a picture book or a science article or even just a reading passage, we want to make sure that we're thinking about how can we include those elements of language comprehension because we know those elements are necessary in order to achieve comprehension. So to do that, we've come up with a really simple framework that you can use with any reading experience. And we simply call this our 3-2-1 for reading. And what this is you are going to do 3 things before you begin reading. First, you're going to activate and build background knowledge. You want to make sure that your students have an understanding of the topic that they're going to be reading about in the text. The second thing you're going to do is explicitly teach key vocabulary words. So remember that example I shared at the beginning of this video? Entropy is a word that showed up in that book. I have no idea what that means, and so I would want to know the definition of that word before I started reading. So thinking about, are there any key words in the text that your students really need to understand? We want to make sure we pre-teach those before we start reading with our students. The third thing you want to do before you start reading is to preview or highlight any of the important text structure features or the genre. This really helps our students activate their literacy knowledge and understand how the text is going to be structured and what information they can anticipate when. So once you've done those 3 things, then you're going to start reading. Now, while you're reading, there's two things that you're going to do. First, you're going to pause at a sentence and you're going to spend some time deconstructing it. That means you're going to talk about the syntax or the sentence structure. Maybe you talk about the type of sentence it is. Maybe you talk about the parts of speech and the function that they play. Maybe you highlight something like a conjunction and explain how it connects two ideas together. Anything to really help students understand that specific sentence. Now, Nancy Hennessy says in her Reading Comprehension Blueprint that comprehension begins at the sentence level. And it makes so much sense. And as our students work their way through upper elementary, sentences become much more complex. And if students can't understand a complex sentence, they're going to struggle to extract meaning from the entire text. So we want to be intentional about highlighting the syntax of the sentences that we're reading. The second thing you're going to do while you're reading is be intentional about asking and answering thought-provoking questions. Questions that really help students with their verbal reasoning. So questions that require inferential thinking and ask students to really, think about what the author is implying, but isn't necessarily directly stating. Having students look for and consider things like figurative language, imagery, anything that maybe isn't directly stated in the text, but is implied. Now, after your students have finished reading, there's one thing you're going to do, and that is assign a written response. First of all, anytime students are able to write about reading, it's a chance for you to get a glimpse at their understanding. So you're able to see what is it that they took away from the text. But the other thing is that writing about reading has been shown to improve students' comprehension. So we know it's going to benefit them from a comprehension level. And the third reason why this is a good thing to do after you've read is that it's an opportunity to reinforce writing skills. So you can talk about the writing process, you can reinforce writing in complete sentences. Anything that you would teach during a writing lesson, you can use with a written response as well. So that's it. It's a simple 3-2-1. And if you use this 3-2-1 with your reading experiences, you're going to be intentional about planning out the elements that we know lead to real deep comprehension. Now, I want to show you what this could look like in your classroom. I know sometimes it's helpful to see an actual concrete visual and a concrete example. So I'm going to share with you some slides from the lessons inside the Stellar Literacy Collective, because I want you to see a really specific example of what this 3-2-1 could look like and how you could present it to your students. Let's say your students are reading a story called Beyond Limits, which is a fictional story about students who are part of an adaptive sports team. Now, I used to be a former fourth grade teacher, and my students weren't very familiar with this idea of adaptive sports. But it's something that is really important to understanding the story. So before we begin reading, I would want to take some time to build their background knowledge around this concept of adaptive sports. So the first thing that I would do is show my students a couple images or pictures of individuals that have limb differences and ask them to tell me, what do they notice? And students would be able to talk about how they see these individuals participating or playing in sports that require some modifications to either equipment or the rules. And so that would allow us to introduce this term adaptive sports. So before we begin reading, students understand that adaptive sports allows individuals with disabilities to participate by either modifying equipment or rules, so that way they can still compete and enjoy recreational sports. So once we've built their background knowledge, then we're going to pre-teach some vocabulary words. So in this specific example, precision is a word that is really important to the story. And so before we explicitly teach what precision is, we're going to give our students an opportunity to practice using context clues. I know context clues show up on pretty much every state standard, so let's give our students some practice with it. We're going to show them the sentence from the text and ask them to tell us if they can figure out what the word precision means. After they've made their predictions, we'll then go through and explicitly teach our students what this word means. We'll give them a kid-friendly definition, we'll show them an image, we'll give them a list of synonyms, so that way they can connect it to words that they already know. We'll also show them the word in context with 2 sentences, so that way students really solidify their understanding of this word. Now, when students see this word in context, they'll know exactly what it means. The last thing we're going to do before we start reading is to preview the text structure. Now, this is a fictional story, so it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we'll simply tell students what they can anticipate and the type of details that they can expect to read in each part of the story. We'll also remind them that they're going to see things like dialogue and, how they can look for the dialogue tags, how there's going to be a theme in the story, which is a lesson that we can apply to our own life, and how there might be some figurative language that they want to be paying attention to. Now that we've previewed all of these things and students have background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, and they've activated their literacy knowledge, we're ready to start reading. Now, once we've read the text, we're going to stop once we get to the sentence. And we're going to take just a minute or two and simply break it down. Now, in this example, we're talking about subject-verb agreement, but you can identify any element that is going to help your students understand sentence structure better. So maybe you want to talk about the type of sentence it is. Maybe you want to talk about how a conjunction is used. Maybe you want to extract excessive words and really help your students understand the main idea of the sentence. And I want you to think about how many of your students struggle with sentence writing and how many of them struggle to understand and apply those grammar skills that you're trying to teach. Well, if you did this every day while you're reading with your students, because I know you're reading every day, that would be a 180 additional opportunities that you would give your students to really deepen their understanding of how sentences work. And I don't know about you, but 180 additional opportunities to reinforce syntax or grammar knowledge would have really helped my students. Now, the other thing you're going to do while you're reading is you're going to be intentional about asking and answering questions that are really going to require students to use their inferential thinking or their verbal reasoning. And in this example, the story really has a strong theme, and that's what we want students to really come away with. So we're asking questions that really target the theme. Now, the last thing you're going to do after you finish reading is you're going to assign some form of written response. And here's the thing that I think is so cool about assigning a written response is even though this is a short response, maybe it's just going to be 3 or 4 sentences, you can use this as an opportunity to reinforce and practice any writing skill that you've already taught your students. Your students could go through the entire writing process. They could brainstorm their response, they could draft it, they could revise, they could edit, they could publish it. You could have them revise it for word choice. You could have them pay attention to their sentence structure and ask them to include a question, a command, an exclamation. You could have them expand their sentences. There's all sorts of very specific writing tasks that you could incorporate into this writing about reading response. And since they're writing about what they read, you're going to get a really good understanding of how they processed the story. Now that you've seen how the 3-2-1 can really help your students deepen their comprehension, let us know in the comments. Is this something that you think you're going to try out with your students in your classroom? Now, if you're looking for ready-to-print lessons that follow this exact framework, we've got you covered. Inside the Stellar Literacy Collective, you can get access to lesson plans, reading passages, and materials that use this exact framework and really make it easy for you to implement it in your classroom. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to stellarteacher.com/join. Now, if you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so that way you don't miss any of the videos that we release. Thank you so much for joining us today and happy teaching.